Welcome, everyone. This is our fun little study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management.
That's right.
Today, we're diving deep into some really essential reading. It's from the required text, Race and Social Equity, a nervous area of government. We're focusing specifically on Chapter 7.
And that title, A Nervous Area of Government, it really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because, tackling racial equity, embedding it into how government works, it's often politically tricky, systemically challenging. It definitely makes agencies, nervous.
Yeah, it challenges the status quo. So our mission today for this deep dive is to look at how one really big agency, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, handles that nervousness.
Yeah.
How do they make their commitment to equity visible to the public? And how do they try to embed it structurally?
And there's a specific constraint here for you, the listener, that we need to keep in mind.
Right.
We are only looking at what the EPA chooses to put out there publicly, specifically on their website.
So no internal memos, no leaked documents, just the public face.
Exactly. We're analyzing their public policy communication because in today's world, that website, it's essentially the face of e-government, right? What they show signals their values, their priorities.
And the reading makes a really strong point here.
Mm-hmm.
Publicly communicating about equity, it's like a necessary first step.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be enough on its own to guarantee change.
Definitely not sufficient enough.
But you have to have that public commitment visible for implementation to even have a chance.
Absolutely. And to really get why this matters, why these policy choices are so weighty, we should start with the stakes involved. The chapter opens with that really stark quote about environmental racism from Danny Glover.
Oh, yeah, the one about lung capacity.
Mm-hmm. The fact that, quote, kids in South Central Los Angeles have a third of the lung capacity of kids in Santa Monica. That single brutal statistic, it just grounds everything we're about to discuss. It shows the real-world health impacts, the unequal burdens that public policy has to grapple with.
Wow. When you put it like that, affecting kids' ability to breathe, it makes equity seem less like like an optional extra and more like the absolute core of what an environmental protection agency should be doing.
Precisely. And the EPA generally channels this focus through the term environmental justice, or EJ.
Right, EJ.
Now, EJ is broad, but when you look at the EPA's publicly stated work, the focus pretty clearly comes back again and again to communities of color, to low-income populations, and there's also very specific attention paid to tribal and indigenous peoples.
So even using the broader term EJ, the commitment to racial equity is still pretty explicit in their materials.
Yes, it definitely comes through that way.
Okay, so let's unpack the history a bit.
Yeah.
How did the EPA get here? It was founded back in 1970 under President Nixon, but it wasn't initially created specifically to tackle environmental justice, right?
That's a really important point. No, its creation was largely a response to these, very visible environmental crises. Rivers catching fire, terrible smog, broad public outcry about pollution.
A general environmental movement concern.
Exactly. But that said, the agency wasn't completely disconnected from civil rights from day one. Even back in 1970, the initial structure included a director of equal opportunity.
Okay, interesting. What was their role?
Their job was basically overseeing civil rights programs and, crucially, compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Title VI. Okay, let's pause on that. For someone studying policy, why is Title VI significant in the context of the EPA? Remind us.
Sure. Title VI is fundamental. It essentially prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in any program or activity that receives federal funding.
And the EPA hands out a lot of federal money grants, permits.
Billions.
Yeah.
So Title VI gives the EPA a legal obligation. They have to ensure their decisions, like who gets a permit to pollute or where toxic waste cleanups happen, don't disproportionately harm minority communities.
So the legal hook for equity was there from the start.
The mechanism was there, yes. But the focus, the political will to specifically target environmental impacts through that equity lens, that wasn't really the priority back then.
Okay, so if the legal tool existed, why did it take, 2 decades? And all this external pressure for environmental justice to become a formal central part of EPA policy in the early 90s?
Well, because as you know, policy focus rarely shifts without a push. Either strong political leadership or, in this case, significant social mobilization.
Right.
And the trigger here was undeniably the powerful grassroots environmental justice movement that really gained steam in the 1980s and 90s.
I'm talking about local groups.
Thousands of them. often local, often community or faith-based groups who were organizing and protesting these really clear, persistent inequities in where environmental hazards like landfills or polluting factories were located.
Communities basically saying, hey, look at the map. The system is concentrating pollution in our neighborhoods.
Exactly. It's literally poisoning us. And the reading highlights a key moment, that 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit.
Why was that summit so important?
It was pivotal because it brought these diverse groups together, and they adopted 17 specific principles of environmental justice. This wasn't just scattered local anger anymore. It became a unified national policy platform. It gave the movement concrete demands that the government couldn't just brush off as isolated incidents.
And they had data to back it up.
Oh, yeah. Decades of it. Studies going way back, the chapter mentions 1972, 78, 80, consistently showing this link. Minority populations, low-income populations, they were bearing a disproportionately higher burden from air pollution, water pollution, pesticides, hazardous waste sites. The evidence was becoming really undeniable.
And that evidence creates political leverage.
Absolutely. So by the early 90s, you have the Congressional Black Caucus, along with researchers and EJ activists, meeting directly with top EPA officials.
And what was their core accusation?
It was pretty direct. They alleged, one, unfair application of environmental enforcement, like inspections weren't happening equally. And two, crucially, that minority communities faced higher environmental risk burdens because of systemic biases in how regulations were made and applied.
That's a serious charge against a federal agency. How did the EPA respond?
Well, the administrator at the time, William K. Riley, under the first Bush administration, he had to respond. In July 1990, he set up the Environmental Equity Work Group.
Okay, a work group. What were they tasked with?
The chapter details 4 primary tasks, and they're really instructive if you're studying how a big bureaucracy starts to grapple with a systemic problem like this.
Let's go through them. Task 1.
Task 1 was basically review the evidence. Is this claim of disproportionate risk actually true? Validate the data.
Okay, establish the facts. Task 2.
Task 2 went deeper. Review current EPA programs. Look internally. Are there factors within our own programs that are causing these different outcomes, these differential risks?
That's a key step, looking inward, not just outward.
Huge. It acknowledges the agency itself might be part of the problem, not just policing external polluters. Task 3 was about reviewing risk assessment and risk communication. How were they calculating risk? Were they considering race and income factors? Were they even communicating these risks effectively to all communities, including, say, non-English speakers?
Right. And Task 4?
Task 4 looked at institutional relationships and outreach. How well was the EPA actually talking with minority and low-income organizations? Was it real consultation, real partnership, or just, checking a box?
So investigating the problem, the internal systems, the methods, and the relationships. Pretty comprehensive.
It was. And the work group's final report came out in June 1992. It was called Reducing Risk in All Communities.
And the conclusion?
It was conclusive. It confirmed the allegation. The report stated, and I'm quoting roughly from the text here, that minority and low-income populations are disproportionately exposed to lead, selected air pollutants, hazardous waste facilities, contaminated fish tissue, and agricultural pesticides in the workplace.
So the internal investigation confirmed the external claims. That must have been the real turning point.
It was the official internal mandate for change, and it led very quickly to formalizing things. The Office of Environmental Equity was established just a few months later, in November 92.
And then renamed.
Renamed in 1994 to the Office of Environmental Justice, the OEJ. And the OEJ wasn't just a nameplate, it became the central hub for this work.
What does it actually do?
Its functions are pretty broad, according to the EPA's own site. It oversees the integration of EJ principles across the entire agency. It's the main point of contact for outreach and education on EJ issues. It provides technical and financial assistance, like grants, to communities. And importantly, it leads the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, which coordinates efforts across different federal departments.
Okay, so we've gone from external protests and data to an internal investigation to a permanent, formalized office with real oversight responsibilities. That definitely signals a shift from a temporary focus to something meant to be structurally embedded. Okay, so the OEJ exists. But how does an agency like the EPA make sure that this commitment to environmental justice, this nervous area, doesn't just get stuck inside that one office? How do they ensure it actually permeates the whole organization?
That's the million-dollar question in public management, isn't it? And the answer, based on what the EPA puts forward publicly, seems to be about embedding it in the core documents that define the agency's identity and guide its resources.
You mean like the mission statement?
Exactly. The mission, the leadership's stated priorities, and critically, the strategic plan. If the commitment only lives in one small office, it's vulnerable. It can get cut, ignored, sidelined. But if it's baked into the mission and the strategy that drives the budget,
It becomes much harder to ignore or get rid of.
precisely, it signals deep institutionalization.
Okay, so let's start with the mission. The EPA's overall mission statement is pretty broad, right? To protect human health and the environment.
Very broad. But the reading points us to the accompanying purpose statement, Exhibit 7.2 in the text, which has 7 points elaborating on that mission. And that's where the equity commitment really comes through.
How so?
Well, 3 of those 7 purpose statements explicitly talk about equity. Statement 1 commits to protecting all Americans, and it emphasizes, regardless of where they live, learn, or work.
Using that word all is a clear signal against selective protection.
It is. Then, Statement 3 talks about enforcing federal laws fairly and effectively.
Okay, fairly. As policy students, we should probably unpack that word. What does fairly imply in this context, beyond just applying the rules equally?
Yeah, it's more than just procedural fairness. It suggests recognizing historical context and differential impacts. You know, if pollution was allowed to concentrate in one neighborhood for decades, simply enforcing today's rules equally everywhere doesn't fix that past harm or the ongoing disproportionate risk. Fairly seems to imply acknowledging that history and actively trying to remedy those imbalances.
That makes sense. And the 5th statement. The reading highlights that one too.
Right. It states a commitment to all parts of society, but then it makes a very specific call out to tribal governments.
Why is that specific mention of tribal governments so significant? It's more than just listing another stakeholder group, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a crucial legal and political distinction. The EPA, like all federal agencies, has a unique government-to-government relationship with federally recognized tribes. These tribes are sovereign nations.
So the EPA can't just impose rules on tribal lands the way it might regulate a state.
Exactly. The relationship has to be based on consultation, collaboration, respecting tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and often involves building tribal capacity to manage their own environmental programs. Mentioning them, specifically in the purpose statement, acknowledges this unique legal status and commits the agency to that distinct approach. It's a much deeper commitment than general public outreach.
Okay, so the mission and purpose statements lay the foundation. What about leadership? How do the people at the top signal this priority?
Leadership priorities are critical because that's where the the administrator directs attention, political capital, and ultimately resources. The chapter uses Lisa Jackson's priorities from 2010 as a key example, Exhibit 7.3.
Right, she listed 7 core priorities. How did equity fit in?
It wasn't just one item, it was woven through several. Area 6 was explicitly titled Expanding the Conversation on Environmentalism and Working for Environmental Justice.
So right there in the title.
Explicitly. And
Yeah.
crucially, the description committed to including EJ principles in all EPA decisions. Not just decisions made by the OEJ, but permitting decisions, enforcement actions, rulemaking across the board.
That's that permeation idea, again, breaking it out of the silo.
Exactly. And it shows up elsewhere, too. Area 7 was building strong state and tribal partnerships. This reinforces that unique government-to-government relationship we just talked about with a specific focus on supporting tribal capacity.
Okay. Any others?
Area 4, cleaning up our communities, also had a strong EJ angle. It committed the agency to maximizing the brownfields program.
Let's clarify brownfields for the listener. What are they, and why is focusing on them an EJ issue?
Sure. Brownfields are essentially abandoned or underused industrial or commercial properties where redevelopment is complicated by the presence or potential presence of contamination. Think old factories, gas stations, things like that.
Oh.
And the EJ connection is that historically, these contaminated sites are disproportionately located in or near low-income communities and communities of color. They're environmental hazards and economic drags.
So by prioritizing brownfields cleanup,
The EPA isn't just removing contamination. They're aiming to spur redevelopment, create jobs, and increase property values specifically in these disadvantaged communities. It's about turning a hazardous liability, often a legacy of past industrial discrimination, into an environmental and economic asset for the community that was most harmed.
got it. So leadership priorities clearly signaled EJ as central. How does that translate into the longer-term organizational roadmap, the strategic plan?
Strategic plans are, the formal, disciplined effort to produce fundamental decisions about where an agency is going and how it will use its resources over several years. They're the blueprint.
And the EPA's plan for fiscal years 2011-2015, Exhibit 7.4, directly incorporated EJ.
Explicitly. The plan included a specific goal to, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, reduce and prevent harmful exposures and health risks to children and underserved, disproportionately impacted low-income, minority, and tribal communities.
That's very targeted language. Low-income, minority, tribal, children.
Very. And the plan didn't just state the goal, it dictated the method. It mandated that all EPA programs had to incorporate EJ and children's health considerations at every single stage of developing and implementing regulations.
Every stage, from initial idea to final rule.
That's what the public document says. Scoping, development, implementation. It's meant to be a structural checkpoint, preventing EJ from being an afterthought.
So if someone's writing a new air quality rule, they supposedly have to ask, how does this affect these specific vulnerable populations?
Yes, and they commit to using the best available science to assess those potential disproportionate impacts. The plan even calls out specific vulnerable groups beyond income and race, like women of childbearing age, infants, children, and adolescents.
And the tribal focus, is that in the strategic plan too?
It is. Exhibit 7.5 highlights the goal of strengthening state, tribal, and international partnerships. And within that, there's specific language about increasing tribal capacity and enhancing cross-cultural sensitivity when working on that government-to-government basis.
So we see this consistent thread mission, leadership, strategy, all publicly reinforcing the commitment to environmental justice, and particularly that unique relationship with tribal nations. It's a pattern of embedding it structurally.
Yeah.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really interesting. We've seen the history, the drivers, the structural embedding in mission and strategy. But how does the EPA actually do the work? How do these commitments turn into tangible actions and programs on the ground?
Right, the operationalization piece. It really starts with having a clear, shared definition of what they're aiming for.
The EPA's official definition of environmental justice.
Exactly. They define it publicly as, quote, fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income.
Okay, fair treatment and meaningful involvement. Those seem like the key concepts.
They are. And the definition goes on to say that EJ is achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process.
So it's both about the outcome, equal protection, and the process, equal access to decisions.
Precisely. That combination provides the framework for their operational programs. You need mechanisms for both.
Let's talk about meaningful involvement first. How do they try to ensure that? The reading mentions NEJAC.
Yes. NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It was set up pretty early, back in 1993, and what's key about NEJAC is that it's an external, independent federal advisory committee.
Independent meaning?
Meaning its members are not EPA employees. There are 26 members drawn from diverse backgrounds, community activists, academics, industry representatives, state and local government officials, tribal governments, indigenous groups.
So it brings outside perspectives directly to the EPA administrator.
That's its sole purpose, to provide independent, consensus-based advice on how to integrate EJ into EPA programs and how to improve environmental conditions in those communities that are disproportionately burdened. It's a formal channel for external critique and expertise.
And what kind of advice do they give? Is it just general statements?
Oh, no, it gets quite specific. Table 7.1 in the reading gives examples. They provide detailed recommendations on really complex policy issues.
Like what?
Things like how to improve the design of the Brownfields program for better community benefit, how to make the permitting process itself more equitable so new facilities don't automatically cluster in the same areas, how to handle fish consumption advisories effectively in communities that rely on subsistence fishing. They even advised on the environmental health fallout from the Gulf Coast hurricanes.
Wow. So NEJ tackles the really granular technical policy details, but always through that equity and justice lens.
Exactly. It shows the agency relies on these external experts to help navigate the nitty-gritty of implementation fairly.
Okay, so NEJAC provides that outside-in perspective. What about internal strategy for operationalizing EJ? The reading discusses Plan EJ 2014.
Right. Plan EJ 2014 was developed specifically to mark the 20th anniversary of a really crucial piece of policy, Executive Order 12898.
EO 12898, signed by President Clinton in 1994. Why was that DO such a big deal?
It was a game changer because it directed all major federal agencies, not just the EPA, to make achieving environmental justice part of their mission. Specifically, they had to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse health or environmental effects of their programs and policies on minority and low-income populations.
So it federalized the issue across the government. What was its biggest impact from a policy studies perspective?
Arguably, its biggest impact was legitimizing EJ. It elevated environmental justice from being primarily an advocacy issue or something seen as maybe soft science to being a scientifically acceptable area of federal research, policy analysis, and compliance priority. It put the weight of a presidential order behind it.
Okay, so Plan EJ 2014 was the EPA's internal roadmap building on that EO.
Yes. It was their strategy for how to really weave EJ and civil rights compliance into the fabric of their daily work. Rulemaking, permitting, compliance checks, enforcement actions, all of it.
How was the plan structured to achieve that kind of integration?
It focused on three main types of areas. First, cross-agency focus areas. This is about embedding EJ into core agency functions, like how rules are made or how enforcement is targeted.
Right.
Second, tools development areas. This was about building the internal capacity needed to do the work better, improving the underlying science, sharpening the legal analysis of EJ issues, making information more accessible, securing resources.
So improving the toolkit.
Exactly. And third, specific program initiatives targeting particular issues or communities. This structure aimed to ensure they weren't just changing what they did, but also improving how they did it and the tools they used, all with an equity focus.
Makes sense. Structure and strategy are vital, but policy doesn't happen without resources. That brings us to the grants and programs.
Right. The money follow through. The EPA website details 7 specific grant sources dedicated to funding EJ work.
This is where the public commitment hits the ground.
Absolutely. This is the financial investment that helps turn policy into community-level action. The main one is the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program.
How much money are we talking about?
The reading notes that since 1994, it had awarded nearly $23 million directly to community-based organizations and tribal governments.
And these aren't just blank checks, right? They fund specific projects.
Exactly. They're strategic investments designed to build local capacity to address local problems. The examples in Exhibit 7.6 really show this well.
Let's look at those. The Yakutat Tlingit tribe in Alaska.
Yeah, they received a grant to research potential dioxin contamination affecting their traditional subsistence resources, the food they gather and hunt. This is huge for capacity building. It empowers a sovereign tribe to generate its own scientific data, educate its members about risks, and advocate for protecting its cultural practices and health, which are directly linked to the local environment.
That's a powerful example of self-determination fueled by a federal grant. What about the Toxic-Free NC project?
Another great example, they focused on immigrant farm workers who were often disproportionately exposed to pesticides. The grant helped them educate these workers about the risks and about their rights under the EPA's worker protection standards.
And they did it in plain language.
Yes, plain Spanish and English materials. Crucially, they also worked to help farm workers engage in the federal rulemaking process itself, the process that sets those standards affecting their health. That's meaningful involvement.
And the third example, the Clean Air Coalition in Western New York.
They tackled the health impacts of freight transportation hubs, things like big rail yards or warehouse districts, which are often located right next to minority communities.
Diesel exhaust, particulate matter.
Exactly. They used the grant funding to organize community leaders, educate them about the disproportionate health risks like asthma, and advocate for mitigation strategies. These are all tangible, often science-based efforts targeting specific, measurable health inequities at the local level.
And beyond the Small Grants Program, the reading mentions others.
Yes, there's the Collaborative Problem-Saving Program, which funds larger, more complex projects involving multiple stakeholders working together. There was also specific funding related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, showing that the EJ lens gets applied even in disaster response. And things like the National Clean Diesel Funding Assistance Program, which can be targeted to reduce pollution in overburdened areas.
So a range of financial tools to support different kinds of EJ work on the ground.
Now, coming back to that core theme of public visibility, how the EPA shows its work, this is really evident in how they engage digitally, using what scholars call e-governance.
It's not enough just to have the programs, they have to talk about them.
And invite dialogue. Even scrutiny, that's key. A major example the reading highlights is the EPA's Greenversations blog.
Greenversations, okay, what's its purpose?
It's explicitly designed as a public-facing platform. It's not a technical journal. It's there to promote the agency's EJ work, give updates on initiatives, share stories, and importantly, solicit feedback from the public. It aims to keep the conversation going in the open.
What kind of topics do they cover?
It's pretty broad, showing an effort to connect with different aspects of people's lives. They blog about specific policy tools like school air toxics monitoring, broader concepts like creating green zones in cities, and even culturally specific outreach like environmental justice in the pews, engaging faith communities.
That breadth seems intentional, trying to meet people where they are.
I think so. And the engagement data mentioned is interesting. Posts apparently averaged around 300 likes and generated written comments, though the number varied a lot.
But analyzing those comments, that's where you really see the nervous area tension play out, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating. You get positive feedback validating their efforts. The example given is someone saying, basically, I attended EPA meetings on the Gulf Coast, and they were genuinely engaged with the community.
So, confirmation that the outreach is working, at least for some people.
Right. But then you get the flip side. Really sharp criticism. The other example quoted is stark. EPA has never actually supported citizen involvement. The EPA has always teamed up with the states and industry to undermine and suppress ordinary citizens.
Wow, that's a fundamental challenge to their legitimacy. Why would an agency, especially in a sensitive area like racial equity, allow that kind of direct, harsh criticism on its own public blog?
It seems like a conscious, strategic choice about transparency and maybe accountability.
How so?
Well, by allowing that criticism to be visible, by not deleting it, the EPA signals, at least in theory, that it's open to hearing dissent, even really uncomfortable dissent. It acknowledges that deep mistrust exists, which is frankly unavoidable given the history of environmental racism.
So it validates the criticism as part of the ongoing conversation.
Potentially, yes. It shows they aren't pretending everything is perfect or that everyone trusts them. And that kind of transparency, even when it's painful, is arguably necessary if you're trying to rebuild trust and address systemic injustice. It shows they're listening, even to the anger. It's a slow process, though.
Okay, so the blog is one form of digital outreach. What else do they do?
They also conduct regular quarterly community outreach teleconferences. These are hosted specifically by the OEJ.
And the purpose of these calls?
It's primarily to keep EJ advocates and community members informed about current EPA activities, upcoming grant opportunities, progress on strategic plans like EJ 2014, and to maintain an open channel for dialogue. It's direct operational outreach.
Keeping stakeholders in the loop.
And that coordination extends beyond just stakeholders. It goes across the federal government itself through the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, the EJIWG.
We mentioned this earlier. It was set up under EO 12898 and the EPA chairs it. Why is this group so structurally important?
Because environmental injustice is rarely, if ever, caused by just one agency's actions. It's usually systemic. Think about it. Where people live is affected by housing policy, HUD. Their exposure to traffic pollution is affected by transportation policy, DOT. Workplace exposures fall under labor, DOL. Military-based contamination involves defense, DOD.
Right, it cuts across so many areas.
Exactly. So the EJWG, chaired by EPA, brings together representatives from potentially dozens of federal agencies: justice, education, energy, agriculture, interior, and so on. Its goal is to guide, coordinate, and enhance all federal EJ activities, trying to ensure a more comprehensive whole-of-government approach. It fights against policy silos at the highest levels.
That seems critical for tackling the root causes. Finally, let's circle back to the tribal aspect. You mentioned the unique relationship. Is there specific outreach or policy for tribal nations?
Yes. Beyond the general inclusion, the EPA has developed a dedicated tribal and indigenous peoples environmental justice policy.
And how is that policy put into practice?
It's operationalized through specific policy work groups that focus on 4 key areas, really drilling down into the nuances of the government-to-government relationship in an EJ context.
What are those 4 areas?
Okay, first, figuring out how the EPA can best incorporate EJ considerations when they're doing capacity building work with federally recognized tribes, helping tribes develop their own environmental programs. Second, how to effectively implement EPA's own federal programs within Indian country in a way that respects sovereignty and addresses EJ concerns there.
Okay.
Third, how to work effectively with tribal community-based organizations, which are often grassroots groups within tribal nations that might also need support or capacity building. And fourth, how to coordinate better with other federal agencies, specifically on cross-jurisdictional tribal EJ issues, because sometimes issues span tribal lands and other federal jurisdictions.
So it's a very tailored, multi-pronged approach specifically for tribal nations, recognizing their unique status and needs within the broader EJ framework.
Exactly. It shows a level of specific operational detail that goes beyond just general statements of inclusion. Hashtag conclusion and final takeaways.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Bringing it all together, what does this deep dive into the EPA's public communications tell us about making racial equity work visible in public policy and management, especially for those of us studying it in PP 5340?
Well, I think we can pull out three main themes, or maybe takeaways, directly from analyzing how the EPA presents itself publicly on this nervous area.
Okay, theme one.
Theme one is the importance of acknowledging the historical context. The EPA, on its website and in its documents, doesn't shy away from linking its current EJ work directly back to its origins, back to the pressure from the environmental justice movement, the intervention by the Congressional Black Caucus, the mandate from Executive Order 1-898.
Why is acknowledging that history so important for a public agency?
It builds legitimacy. It shows they understand where the demand for this work came from. It signals that they're not just inventing this out of thin air, but responding to real historical injustices and long-standing community demands. For any public agency tackling equity, showing the history that necessitates the work seems crucial.
Okay, history matters. Theme two.
Theme two is what we kept seeing again and again: permeation and alignment. The commitment to EJ isn't just stuck in the OEJ, it's visibly woven through the foundational mission and purpose statements. It's driven from the top by leadership priorities. It's embedded as a core goal in the strategic plan, and it's operationalized through specific programs, grants, and advisory structures like NEJAC and the EJIWG.
So the message is consistent across different levels and functions of the agency, at least publicly.
Exactly. The work appears focused, thematic, and well-aligned, at least in terms of public presentation. When you see that kind of strong public visibility, it usually suggests, or at least aims to project, that the commitment is deeply integrated organizationally.
Right. And the third theme?
Theme three is about flexibility, recognizing it's not one size fits all. The EPA, based on its public materials, doesn't rely on just one single strategy. They use a whole toolkit.
Like what?
Like internal mandates, embedding EJ in rulemaking, external partnerships and advice, NEJAC, high-level federal coordination, EJIWG, direct financial support to communities, grants, and modern digital outreach and feedback loops, the blog, teleconferences. They seem to use an array of activities tailored to different needs and audiences.
So combining internal integration with external collaboration and targeted support.
Precisely. It suggests that effectively promoting EJ requires a flexible, multi-pronged approach, using legal, financial, political, and communicative tools strategically.
So for us studying policy in PP 5340, the EPA's public-facing strategy provides a really detailed example, almost a template for how a large bureaucracy can try to visibly embed and operationalize a commitment to a challenging, nervous priority like racial equity.
Yes. They've clearly leveraged e-government tools to communicate their values, to show ongoing efforts, like through grant examples, and crucially, to invite that continuous, sometimes critical public feedback that is supposedly necessary for policy to adapt and improve over time.
Which brings us to that final provocative thought that the source material leaves us with. It's really a challenge, isn't it?
It is. It's a challenge posed to every public sector organization, but also directly to you, the learner, the listener, to apply this lens yourself.
Challenge B.
Go look at the website of your own local government agency, your city's planning department, your regional transit authority, your state's environmental agency. Does their public communication, their website, reflect a clear value and prioritization of racial equity?
Is it explicit? Is it front and center in their mission, their plans, their news updates?
Or is it buried?
Yeah.
Obscure. Maybe mentioned once in a diversity statement somewhere, but not integrated into their actual program descriptions or strategic goals?
Because, as the reading implies, the answers to those questions about visibility and integration send incredibly clear messages to the public.
Undeniable messages. They signal the agency's real value system, its true operational priorities, and maybe its actual track record when it comes to tackling these crucial, often uncomfortable, nervous areas of government.
So visibility isn't just about PR. It's about accountability and signaling genuine institutional commitment.
Exactly. In these difficult areas, making the commitment visible, making the work transparent, warts and all, it's not just a nice to have. It's pretty essential if you're serious about driving systemic change and achieving justice.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these essential readings for PP 5340. We really hope this encourages you to start looking critically for those public signals, or the lack thereof, of equity commitment in the governmental organizations all around you.
Absolutely. Critical thinking often starts with analyzing what the government chooses to show you and maybe asking questions about what it chooses not to show you. Keep questioning, keep digging,